Okay, welcome back. We're about to change the pace a bit. We're going to take an academic focus to the same subject now. So I would like to welcome the first speaker in this later session. And I hope that I'll say her name in a presentable way. Malgorzata Smieszek from the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland. The floor is yours.
So, good afternoon, everyone. As Margaret said, my name is Malgorzata Smieszek. I'm the researcher at the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland in Rovaniemi, Finland. And well, I hope that after the first two presentations, I will still be able to offer you some insights on the EU Arctic policy. So, shortly presenting the outline of the presentation. Before I go into details of the EU Arctic policy, I would like to first set a little bit stage for the EU itself. Then I would move to the EU Arctic policy documents, and I will offer how we can read them a little bit all together and what they really mean for the EU Arctic policy. After this, I will shortly go through sectoral policies of the EU, and before going to final remarks, I would like to still make a point of the quite new British and German Arctic policy frameworks, which are pretty new development in the area. So starting with setting the EU stage. Well, first of all, what I would like to say very much is that when we are talking about the European Union, and in particular in the Arctic context, it very much sounds like as the EU was the unitary actor. And this is how it is presented. But still, I believe that for deepening the discussion about the EU and for better understanding how its policy is being formulated, it is important to remember that there are various institutions in the EU. The Parliament, the Commission, not to name all of them, but the one with relevance for the Arctic. This is European Parliament, the Commission, and the Council of the European Union, which operate on very different principles, which obviously are construed in completely different manners. And I believe it all has also its significance for the EU Arctic policy. One thing, can you hear me well? Because I think there is some, okay. Second thing is the Lisbon Treaty, just to shortly draw your attention that when we are talking about the development of the EU Arctic policy, what happened in the meantime was the Lisbon Treaty. That changed a lot in the institutional setting of the European Union, where the most important development was definitely formation of the European Union External Action Service. And this came only with the Lisbon Treaty and with 2009. So what we've already heard from Hannu in his presentation, we should also remember that the EU has different kinds of competences. And the first ones, well, as you can see here, these are exclusive, shared, and complementary competences. So just to remember shortly what Hannu said, in fact, what is important for the Arctic, it's that only conservation of marine biological resources comes into exclusive competences of the European Union. All the rest is shared with the member states of the Union. And it's also what should be remembered that in most of the things, the EU very much depends on the implementation of all its policies on the member states. So I believe it's worth to point it here. Next thing is the European Economic Area Agreement. Of course, of great importance here in Iceland, also for Norway, where, as Timo Koivorava puts it, it's this kind of regulations that are in close association with the European Union. So on the one hand, we have internal regulations of the EU, but then we have those in close association. So they mostly concern internal market. And with what is important that from this agreement, common fisheries and agriculture are excluded. But still, most of the other regulations they apply to Iceland and Norway. And in fact, if I'm correct, from 6,000 legislation pieces that were added to this agreement, for example, Norway contested only 17 of them, meaning that all the others were implemented. And when we are talking about the kinds of legislative and non-binding acts, I would like to make a short comment, like what type of documents the EU already published on the Arctic policy. Because first, as we'll see in the moment we have resolutions of the European Parliament, then we have communications from the European Commission, and finally we have conclusions of the Council. What are these documents? Their most important feature is that they are non-legally binding. And resolutions of the European Parliament, they mostly aim at giving impetus to some political or legislative processes. Secondly, communications from the European Commission, very often they are also non-legally binding or otherwise binding, but they very often they express the view of the Commission on the given topic. In our case, it is the Arctic. They often include suggestions for further action, for policy actions, and they often could be compared to sort of opening bid for the European Union. Still, to become official expression of EU policies, they should be endorsed by the Council. And this is what Council did with its conclusions, which, as said, they are non-binding. But what should be remembered, and I find this also important in this context, is that conclusions of the Council of the European Union, these are acts agreed on anonymously by all the member states. So it means that actually every single sentence in this document has been approved by all the member states of the European Union, and we should remember about that. Sorry. Okay, so going briefly through the documents. Well, we've heard in the first presentation that it was the European communication which started the EU Arctic policy, which is only half true, because 1 month earlier, this was quite famous European Parliament resolution on Arctic governance. Well, it was famous mostly for its one piece, where the European Parliament quite famously called the European Commission to prepare for opening of the negotiations of the international negotiations for the treaty that would have relevance to the Arctic and which would be based on the example of Antarctic Treaty. Well, as we all know, this is not really the stance really approved by any of the Arctic states, and still this document. Well, it didn't give, already from the very start, it didn't give really good press to the EU on the Arctic matters, even though it should be remembered that this is not the official stand of the European Union on the matters. It was very often misinterpreted this way, but it was only a second document, which was already mentioned here. The first communication from the Commission, which came, as said, 1 month later in November 2008, which really laid the grounds for the EU Arctic policy. I'm not going to go exactly through all the documents because we already heard the objectives, so the main objectives of the document. So to preserve and protect the Arctic environment in unison with the Arctic population, to promote sustainable use of resources, and also to enhance the multilateral governance in the region. This document was already much more nuanced in comparison to the Parliament document, but still included some elements which were not that well taken. So, for example, it was referring to fragmented legal framework applying to the Arctic, to some omissions in the governance system. So there were still issues that were not that well taken. Yet the document was endorsed by the Council conclusions 1 year later, in December 2009, and the conclusions were also calling for further development of the Arctic policy. What came in the meantime, like from these conclusions to the moment where we are right now, was a second resolution from the European Parliament in January 2011. Then we have a second communication from the Commission with these 3 keywords that were set here, so engagement, responsibility, and knowledge. And it's what I mentioned about the Lisbon Treaty here is already reflected in this document. That this was joint communication, and this was like with the inclusion of, well, that it was very much drafted, and the High Representative for the Foreign Policy was very much involved. In the preparation of this document already. This document was also expected earlier, something like in the middle of 2011. Yet it was all these institutional changes and tensions in the Union that also had their impact on the Arctic policy. What we see right now, and one document that I just wanted to mention, which is not put on the slide, is that still in April 2013, what we've seen was the European Economic Social Committee, which also issued its opinion on Arctic policy, and it was said that this is the view from the society. But the moment that we are right now in is actually the European Parliament resolution on the EU strategy for the Arctic from March this year, and Council conclusions on developing European Union policy towards the Arctic, which were published just not even three weeks ago. And yes, it works. All right, so summing up a little bit, as said, not going into details, what I would like to point out here that when we are reading this, when we are reading EU Arctic documents, I would like to stress that I find this very much a learning process, because when we go back in time and when we look at the time when the first communication was issued, this was year 2008. In fact, when we look at the Arctic documents of Arctic states themselves, it seems that the EU was pretty much front runner, because it was Norway who had its document earlier, but actually Iceland, Finland, and other countries, for example, they issued their documents in 2009, like the basic ones that already got significance and a lot of coverage. So in fact, this development came quite early, and I think part of the misunderstanding was exactly came from the little knowledge that was at the time. It was really the moment where Arctic was becoming an issue. It was still very early. We didn't have a knowledge about what's happening right now. It was still before China applied for the first time for the observer status to the Arctic Council. Everything was before that. So I suppose I would say this relevant here, because what we can see is in the course of time, the EU developed more nuanced approach. So like the first flaws, so to say, well, first drawbacks of the documents, well, they were fine-tuned with the course of time. Like the documents were less and less controversial, and trying to become more substantial in their content. As said, they were written in more weighted, fine-tuned language. So we do not find any more references to Antarctic Treaty. The EU also very clearly from the very first moment, from the very first communication of the Commission, based its policy and stressed the importance, for example, of UNCLOS, of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, applicable to the Arctic. So all the contentious matters were really rather kept out of the documents. So to me, it implies that that we are still in the process of this gradual formulation of the EU Arctic policy. That this is not something that was set ready from the very beginning. That this is still very much developing process. And what we see in the conclusions from the Council just from 2 weeks ago is that EU should now further enhance its contribution to Arctic cooperation. So what Hannu was saying, that right now certain actions are expected to take place until the end of 2015. And well, what will happen, we still see. And if it works, yes. So just a few words, because what I would like to stress very much here is that when we are talking about the EU Arctic policy, it's only one part of the big influence that EU can exert in the Arctic. Because somewhat like more important, perhaps even are the sectoral policies. And they were already mentioned here, so I'm not going to go deeply through them. It's just I wanted to say that the two pictures that you see here, they are actually, of course, they are not coincidental, because the ships in the upper photo, these are actually ships from the Beluga Company, the first German company that sent ships through Northwest Passage. They were the first one to cross it there. So it's by no means coincidence, and these are not any kind of ships just going there, but the ones with the EU flag. And second photo is actually Kiruna, is the place where last year Arctic Council meeting took place, because very important place for the mining sector, which is right now very big, which is going right now through very rapid development in the Arctic. But just to present you briefly, well, first of all, climate change. Well, it was already presented here by Richard. Of course, energy. Like all these issues here, they are of crucial importance because of the commercial impact that the EU can have on its development. So, for example, like with energy, last year, producers, for example, from Norway, they clearly expressed their concerns about, for example, about uncertainty of certain energy developments in the EU policy, because for them it's a question of investment. So if the EU is not clear or it's hesitant, or depending how it sets its goal, it may have really big impact on how investments will proceed also in the Arctic region. With maritime transport, safety and shipping, I'm not going to go into details because Andreas will cover this topic. Fisheries obviously is the big thing, and there is the common fisheries policy of the EU for the region. So it is very much an issue, not only like of the commercial impact, but also clearly how legislation on these matters is being set. Mining, not of such great relevance in all parts of the Arctic, but on the other of great significance in some. And here, for example, the EU legislation is of great importance, because if, for example, even if we look at and one more thing is that mining regulations are also of relevance to the EEA countries, so Iceland and Norway. And for example, when we look about the environmental impact assessment directive, which sets minimal standards for this, it is really important to look at this kind of legislation. Finally, research. And I'm not going to go through the numbers of how much money EU devotes to the research relevant to the Arctic. Here I just wanted to say that what was at the beginning of April, when I was at the Arctic Science Summit Week in Helsinki, we could hear the opinion from the representatives of the United States National Science Foundation, who clearly pointed out that the kind of research money that the EU is able to devote to the research is a challenge for them. That it is a really relevant point, because seeing how important is sustaining research and science in the Arctic, they really find it challenging that the entity, as the EU, is able to put so much money in there. So, and seeing that the EU is not really going to challenge the priorities of the Arctic states, well, there is definitely a platform where the EU can contribute significantly. Before going to final points, I wanted to mention here briefly two recent developments within the EU, but also, well, in the Arctic, so to say. And these are UK and German Arctic policy frameworks, which, first thing is that these are first national policies of observers, of state observers to the Arctic Council. Because so far we were dealing only with documents coming from the Arctic states. But this is the new situation, and it's pretty new because the documents were published in fall 2013. Actually, they were released just within a few weeks' time from each other. And they very much also confirmed the growing significance of the region, because what we see right now, the whole debate about observers, as we know, last year focused about giving or not giving access mostly to Asian states, plus Italy, to the Arctic Council. And this was where debate was focused. But right now what we see are the old observers detailing their Arctic priorities, setting their Arctic interests. And not only these two states, but also a third EU country, Arctic Council observer state, France. Their roadmap, Arctic roadmap, is expected in November 2014. And why this all matters? Because from the two documents that you can see here in the slides, they both adopt very, very different language. So when you go through the UK document, you will realize that this is the one that is very appeasing, that does not contain any contentious or conflictual points, not at all. It is the one that actually is written very much to confirm every single criteria for observers from the NUC document. So when Arctic Council set the criteria for the observers in NUC in Greenland in 2011. On the contrary, German document is completely different. It sets much more explicitly German interests, but it also raises the points that do not really have to be do not have to be so pleasant to Arctic states. For example, Germany in its document says that UNCLOS indeed is the basis for the Arctic ocean management, but it's not sufficient, that there are still things that UNCLOS cannot regulate. Furthermore, German Arctic policy frameworks very clearly insist on freedom of navigation and scientific research in the Arctic. As we know, this is the matter that is by no means obvious to all the Arctic states. And right now we have a state that has very clear interest and potential, also technological know-how in maritime issues, which is stating its interest in quite explicit manner. So the point is how this will impact the EU Arctic policy. Will it at all? What will be the voice of the UK and Germany in light of their new documents in the EU setting? Well, this is the thing that we are about to see. And coming to final remarks, as already mentioned, I would like to point out that the EU Arctic policy is very much work in progress. So we are still seeing developments and what is being done in the issue. One of the things is that what brought that much, perhaps, attention, but also controversy, is that, in fact, the EU, through its Arctic policy, is setting itself as a foreign policy actor in another area. So it was obviously growing significance, geopolitical importance of the Arctic that brought the EU to pay attention to this area. But we should be aware that these were very much also internal systemic interests within the EU. So particularly Commission and then External Action Service pushing to have their role, to have their set on this. But as I wanted to point out with the slide that you've seen a minute ago, it was very much that when this core of the EU Arctic policy was developed, it was at the time where member states of the EU, where they didn't have their own Arctic policies. This was very much absent from the context. It really left all the field, all the area for the EU institutions. It's a different element from other EU regions, because if we look, for example, at Eastern Partnership, at issues of the Mediterranean, these are the places where member states of the EU had very much their clear interests. And they were sort of running these issues. Arctic was, well, the new place for this development, and with no clear member states' interest there. Finally, matter of perception. I think this is the thing that is that once again is relevant to the EU, because in general, and it's very much the case going beyond the Arctic, is that EU in general has bad press for most of these issues. The European Union is hardly ever praised, and EU member states bear actually a lot of responsibility for that, because if for no other reasons, I would say that having the EU that can be blamed for many unpopular decisions is very common move in most of the EU member states. So it applies both to the internal EU matters as well to the outside world, where the EU is not very well understood, and very often for this gets bad or worse press. And this brings me to my last point, with which I would like to conclude this presentation, is that one of the issues is the nature and function of the European Union. It very much depends how we understand the EU, because as Anand Menon put it, like there has been equal bad done to the EU, both by people who are overly enthusiastic about its possibilities, and also by people who are overly critical of what the EU is really doing. And my point is here that I would like to stress that I think it's time, and this seminar is a great occasion for this, to go beyond this, to really understand better what the nature of the EU is and what function can the EU serve. Because my personal opinion is that European Union is not about to replace states. It was like the EU, what it can do is to help states in tackling, in facing challenges that go clearly beyond their capacities. And this is what the EU has been doing for its member states, but this is also the thing that the EU can do abroad. And I think the Arctic is a pretty good area for that. And with this, I would like to finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Andreas Raspotnik from the Arctic Institute, and he will take a somewhat different angle on the same subject. So Andreas.
All right, thank you, Margaret, for the introduction, for the invitation. It's a bit tricky to speak as the last person on the EU in the Arctic when everybody has already said everything. So what we thought with Malgorzata before the event was that I may come up with some questions already when giving this presentation, maybe directly directed to Richard and maybe to people in the audience as well, about what the European Union has already done in the Arctic and how the different actors within the European Union have done it, and what could have done better, or what could have done, or what was done actually quite good. I always like to start my presentations now with this picture, because it kind of shows that the European Union, to some extent, was already in the Arctic way before 2008. I hope my Dutch friends will forgive me. This is William Barents on his last trip to the Arctic, or to the Barents Sea, when he died there, and the Netherlands are still a kind of positive member state to the European Union, although the elections were rather bad recently. But yeah, so some Europeans were already there. Maybe I refer to myself as well. I'm Austrian, so I'm not really connected to the Arctic on a personal level, but I'm still here, and even the Austrian energy provider ÖMV is now starting to drill in the Barents Sea. So there are European actors, European businesses, European people interested in the Arctic that are not originally from that area. All right. Just a general starting point again, I mean, you have this different kind of perception what the Arctic is and how you perceive the Arctic, and how different kind of national actors or state entities like the European Union perceive this kind of area. And you have this differentiation between Arctic states, Arctic actors on the one hand, and other states who perceive the Arctic in a more like a global than in a more regional way, like the European Union, or for example also China, although China has not issued any official documents or policy documents on the Arctic. To start about the discussion again, a very major issue I think we do in our research, and we think about when we talk about the European Union beyond its northern borders, is the question is the issue about the extent of Europe. What is the Arctic actually? And I will go into that later, and I ask this question to the audience and to everyone who is interested in that regard. What does the Arctic actually mean to the European Union? What kind of... We talk about the southern neighborhood, we talk about the eastern neighborhood, we talk about northern dimension, but what is the Arctic actually beyond the very initial geographic, legal, political, or even social borders? So that's the first question people have to keep in mind. I mean, we heard a lot about the most recent European Parliament resolution on the Arctic, and in a press release by the European People's Party, the EPP group, the former rapporteur on the 2011 EP resolution, German Michael Gall, I think is his full name, clearly quoted that the European Union should stake its claim in the Arctic. Again, as Malgorzata said before, and we heard before, a union of many voices, a union of many actors. This was just one actor, but keeping in mind the Lisbon Treaty again, European Parliament is becoming an even more stronger actor, and so this is a clear voice, stake its claims in the Arctic, whatever these claims are. However, that is just one example in that first discussion about the first issue. We have to think about what does the Arctic actually mean to the European Union as such. I mean, is it an expansion of competencies, of concerns? How do you combine and find this nexus of legal competences, political competences, maybe even moral competences with the actual concerns that are happening in the Arctic? Is it energy security? Is it climate change? Is it more indigenous people rights and so on? We heard a couple of things about the EU's Arctic Council observer status and the actual application process to it, and this never-ending debate between the European Union and Canada, and how this actually influenced the final decision on observer status or not. Maybe there are some more people who know more about Canada in that regard, but it seems like it's more like a national issue within Canada than an international issue, and a clear problem with regard to the European Union. Yet in that regard, maybe the first question already directed to Richard in that regard, we have heard about the positive momentum in EU and Canadian relationship, which in my opinion refers to the recently negotiated free trade agreement. Yet I am not a politician, I'm not an official within the European Commission or the External Action Service, nor the Canadian official, but couldn't the ban on the seal product and the small problem there, couldn't that be a topic throughout these negotiations? Or maybe was it a topic, or was neither of the parties intend to put that on the table when discussing the free trade agreement? Because I think, as far as I'm concerned, negotiations were rather quick, and I think the decision was rather reached quite fast in that regard. However, first question maybe also for you in the audience to think about. Yet we already heard about before what kind of actions the European Union can already do, that they have certain kind of legal competencies in the Arctic, in the European Arctic as such, but also beyond. For example, if European businesses go to the Arctic or to Arctic areas in order to conduct business. And there we face this problem, or not problem, but this kind of nexus about territorial presence versus functional presence. So even if you're not an Arctic state per se, you have a functional presence up there with regard to the acquis communautaire and to the legal competence of the European Union. That's more or less what Malgorzata talked before. The interesting thing in that regard is just more like that you have a myriad of conflicting frames within the different kind of institutions or actors that affect the policy making, but I'll not go much more into detail. So how can you summarize the policy steps taken, and what were the problems throughout the, I don't know if I can go here. So what were the problems throughout the last couple of years in that regard? We heard that the Commission was kind of a policy entrepreneur in that regard, that although the EP already came up with a resolution a couple of weeks before, it seems that the Commission was kind of pushy and started with the first communication. After Lisbon, and really with Lisbon, we have now this kind of dual relationship, joint communication with the Commission and the External Action Service working together on the development of Arctic policy, of other policy fields as such. The question one could raise here, how does this relationship actually function and how does it work? I mean, people dealing with these issues, like us researchers, know that there are meetings from time to time where Arctic policy as such is discussed, but it would be interesting to hear more about who is actually taking the lead in that regard. Is it more the External Action Service or the Commission and the DG Mare for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries in that regard? And does it matter who is actually taking the lead in that regard? As like if Commission DG Mare focused maybe more on policy fields as such, and the External Action Service maybe more regarded as a foreign policy actor, whatever. Or maybe it doesn't matter at all, and we are like, and our research remains in the library maybe, and it doesn't matter like that. But that could be an interesting question. Maybe again, we can ask here and maybe get an answer to that. The next point is actually what's the role of the European Parliament. We heard that they started with their first resolution. Maybe you can refer to them as a problem seeker, Arctic Treaty suggestion. They came up just recently. They are, I think that was before the latest resolution. There was also discussion on the Svalbard Treaty again within the European Parliament and the fisheries protection zone around Svalbard. Which created some problems. I was in Norway for the last couple of months, so it created some problems within Norway that the European Parliament again discussed Svalbard. However, it was not referred to the European Parliament as such. It was again referred to the European Union as a common actor within Norwegian media. So that leads to the final question. So do we talk about what Malgorzata already mentioned about one union, one voice, question mark? How many voices are actually creating Arctic policy or any policy within the European Union? And in my opinion, the most important question, how are these voices interpreted from the outside? How can we as researchers, how can we as European citizens, or how can European institutions actually create a better understanding of how to understand these voices? Because if the European Parliament discusses Svalbard issues and fishery protection issues around Svalbard, that's in their very nature, they can do so. Environmental committees within the European Parliament can discuss an Arctic moratorium. However, that doesn't mean that the entire European Union is discussing a moratorium in the Arctic. It's just one small committee or one committee within the European Parliament. So the question is really, how do we interpret these voices from the outside? In that regard, it's also maybe quite interesting, at least for me, that the European People's Party, in their single motion to the latest resolution, referred to the External Action Service maybe in a more critical view. They were not very fond of the External Action Service as the coordinating authority within the Arctic policy development process. So maybe I can ask you, Richard, that was not part of the joint motion of the resolution as such, but it was put forward by the strongest political group within the Parliament. Why that happened? You know, it was only the European People's Party. Maybe, yeah. Why did this particular political group came up with that rather strong statement in their single motion? And actually, another question, maybe referring to the latest resolution. The question was that the European Parliament asked the Commission to further prioritize Arctic policy development. And it would be interesting to hear how this will actually happen. How can the External Action Service / the Commission prioritize, per se, Arctic policy development within the legal apparatus or within the political apparatus in Brussels? rather more things. Yeah, and that's actually the two big question in general I would like to ask to the audience or to think about. Again, what does the Arctic actually mean to the European Union? What kind of space is the Arctic for the European Union? Do we talk about one single Arctic or more Arctics? Like it was again the European, within the EP resolution, it was only one political group, ALDE, the Liberals, that explicitly mentioned the European Arctic as such. Other actors within the Brussels community often still talk about the Arctic as a more bigger issue and not like about many different Arctics. I mean, Arctics, if you deal with Arctic issues, you know that the Barents Sea Arctic is a different kind of Arctic than the Bering Strait Arctic, or the High Arctic Ocean, or the Russian Arctic. So economic development, there's a difference when we talk about economic development within the Barents Sea or in the High Arctic Ocean. However, this does not seem a common view within Brussels. Some actors within the European Union, use a different approach to it, like meaning talking about one Arctic or many Arctics, and some does not. The final resolution of the Parliament mentioned, though, that the Arctic differs substantially. So that's the first question we have to keep in mind. How does the European Union, or the second one, how does the European Union actually define the Arctic, and how do they actually now try to come from the words they put in these many nice policy documents to deeds? So what will happen after we have finished the work on the policy documents? What's the next step? How can you actually stake your claims within the Arctic, or is that not something interesting? Yes. Malgorzata said I will mention a bit the Arctic shipping and the European Union as such. Throughout the documents, Arctic shipping as such is not clearly formulated, it's only vaguely formulated. We talk about sustainability, a very nice term we hear in every Arctic document all over the Arctic, yet it's, in my opinion, a rather vague term. Nobody really, it takes time to define what sustainability means, or sustainable development. You know, how can you actually measure sustainability or sustainable development? Then maritime safety, research, environmental impacts are mentioned, yet rather vaguely. However, in my opinion, this refers to, are there actually any economic considerations about Arctic shipping as such? I mean, we are all here because we're interested in the Arctic. People like from outside the Arctic became interested in the area because there was a lot of talk about how this region will change and how this region will become the new global hub for energy issues, for Arctic shipping, whatever, you know. But I mean, since the last couple of years, there's a lot of talk, but not much happened because of various reasons, because of different kind of developments all over the world, because maybe not all Arctic routes are that feasible, and that it's still cheaper and still safer and still faster to use other routes. Whatever, you know, like it's Arctic issues as such is not something that it popped up quite quickly, but like it will still take time before it becomes a real matter in global affairs. So that's why I think at least that's my interpretation why Arctic shipping intention were rather vaguely formulated. And yet again, we talk about policy documents by the European Union, by the Commission / the Arctic, the External Action Service. Yet it's a business decision if you want to go through the Arctic, if you want to use Arctic routes or not, and not per se a decision by institutions in Brussels. Yeah, I'll not go much more deeper into the issue of what the European Union could actually do with regard to Arctic shipping. We may know that there's currently negotiations about a so-called polar code within the International Maritime Organization in London. European states are very active there. The European Commission is very active there. And I think the Polar Code will be decided rather soon. And of course, if you deal with legal issues, you may know that both the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route, it's rather unclear which kind of, in the end, legal frame. It's clear which kind of legal framework applies to, but the legal interpretation that differs between Russia/Canada and more maritime states. However, yes, there are some legal things the European Union could do, but however, as long as everything is peaceful and everything goes smoothly, I don't think much will change. And something more, maybe more for the Icelandic people from Iceland here. The question is, we heard it before, what could actually Iceland do, or what could be Iceland's role within the European Union if there would be an Icelandic member state? So could Iceland as such boost or strengthen the EU's role in the Arctic or not? And would that be actually of Icelandic interest or not? The question or the example I put up here is research we do currently about technology issues in the Arctic and how new technological developments could change the Arctic as such and could globalize the region, or could even further globalize the region. And we mainly talk about issues of big data here. I mean, most of us have a smartphone. The entire development, the continuous development will bring us more and more data storage we need. And more companies actually go further north because it's just less expensive to have big data firms in the north because of obvious reasons. It's colder, and as an example of Iceland here, there are a couple of companies here that are rather prominent in that sector, and they argue with regard to cheaper energy and the colder environment. And they're also more famous unknown companies like Google and Facebook. They're not in the Arctic per se, but Facebook is rather close. They're in Luleå, Sweden, because of economic reasoning. And we will see more and more companies at least considering opening up data firms closer to the Arctic or maybe even in the Arctic. And could that be, if we discuss Icelandic-EU relationship, could that be a small field, a small area of cooperation or not? At least something to be seen and something at least to think about. All right. Thank you very much.